Vera Colton's been on that street for 32 years, Officer Craig Dunbar said, throwing the cruiser into gear. She knows who belongs there. Danny Ortega looked at the dispatch record on his terminal. Caller reports suspicious individual in backyard of recently sold property. He read it twice. He said nothing. He stared through the windshield as Dunbar accelerated onto Birchwood Avenue with the specific urgency of a man who had already written the end of a story before he knew its beginning. 2 streets away, on a quiet Sunday afternoon in Harwick Estates, Ohio. The end of that story was not yet written. It would be written in the weeks and months that followed, in courtrooms and depositions and a civil rights filing that would cost the city of Harwick Estates more money than it had ever spent on a single case. But right now, at 3:41 p.m. on a Sunday in July, the backyard at 412 Birchwood Avenue was simply a backyard. Hickory smoke rose in a steady ribbon from a heavy-duty offset smoker positioned at the far left of a freshly cut lawn. The smoke carried a specific, rich scent of seasoned brisket that had been cooking since 6 that morning. A Bluetooth speaker on the patio table played something low and unhurried. Coltrane, A Love Supreme, the first track. A garden along the south fence was in its early stages, the soil still dark from recent planting, the first green shoots of pepper seedlings visible in the afternoon light. A man sat in an Adirondack chair he had purchased 3 weeks ago from a hardware store on Route 9. It was the first piece of outdoor furniture he had ever owned. He was sitting in it with the specific awareness of a person who knows that they have arrived, finally, at a place they have worked a very long time to reach. On the upper right corner of the privacy fence gate, mounted to a steel bracket with 4 hex bolts, was a small black camera housing. The man had installed it himself, 3 Saturdays ago. The first full weekend after closing, he had run the cable along the fence interior, tested the cloud upload, checked the coverage angles from 3 different positions in the yard until the frame was exactly what he needed it to be. He had done this methodically and without announcement, because he was a man who had spent 15 years in environments where the difference between documentation and the absence of documentation was a consequential difference, and he did not see why that calculus should change simply because he was now in Ohio. He had also installed a camera covering the front driveway approach and one covering the side gate. He had not told anyone about any of them. His name was Marcus Reeves. He was 36 years old. He had served 2 combat tours in Afghanistan with the 75th Ranger Regiment. He had come home the second time with a Bronze Star with Valor, a combat infantryman badge, and a recurring dream about a specific road on a specific afternoon that he had largely learned to manage. He had used a VA loan and 11 years of disciplined savings to purchase this house, and he had checked the deed 3 times at closing to confirm that his name was on it, because he was a man who documented things. The camera on the gate was recording in 4K. Craig Dunbar was 2 streets away, certain he knew who belonged where. What Vera Colton had actually done, though she would not understand this for several months, when the certified letter from a civil rights attorney arrived at her door, was set in motion the most expensive mistake the Harwick Estates Police Department had ever made. Harwick Estates was the kind of suburb that had arrived at its current form through decades of careful, unspoken agreement between its residents about what the neighborhood should look and feel like. The lawns were maintained on a schedule that nobody had formally established, but everyone observed. The mailboxes on Birchwood Avenue were aligned to within 2 inches of each other, a uniformity that had emerged not from any HOA requirement, but from the particular social pressure of a neighborhood where deviation from the visible standard was noted and remembered. The oak trees that lined both sides of the street were mature, 60, 70 years old, and produced a canopy in summer that turned the street into a tunnel of green and dappled light that was genuinely beautiful. Whatever else you might say about the place, it was not a high-crime area. It was, in measurable fact, one of the lowest crime residential areas in the county. The police department's own statistics showed a combined property and violent crime rate that sat in the lowest quartile for the state. There was no rational basis for police suspicion of anything in Harwick Estates on a Sunday afternoon in July. The house at 412 Birchwood had a freshly painted white exterior with dark blue shutters that Marcus had not chosen. They had come with the house, but that he had found he liked, particularly in the morning when the light hit them from the east, and they held the color well. He had spent the first 2 weekends after closing cleaning the interior, organizing the kitchen, assembling the furniture he had ordered in the weeks before moving in. The third weekend, the weekend before this one, he had turned his attention to the backyard, mowing, edging the fence line, and planting the garden along the south fence that now showed its first tentative growth. He had also, that third weekend, installed the cameras. He had done it on Saturday morning, methodically, beginning with the rear gate because that was the highest priority access point. 4 hex bolts, a cable run along the inside of the fence, a junction at the back corner of the house where the outdoor power supply was already in place. The camera housing was compact and matte black, unobtrusive unless you were specifically looking for it. He had tested the angle from the patio, from the smoker position, from the garden, until the frame captured the full gate area, the path from the gate to the patio, and the upper right quadrant of the patio itself. Then he had moved to the side gate and the front driveway, completing the installation before noon. He had told no one about the cameras, not because he was secretive about it, but because it had not occurred to him to mention it. The same way a man does not mention checking the lock on his front door. It was simply what you did. It was what he had always done. The brisket had been smoking for 9 hours when Marcus checked the internal temperature at 3:30 p.m. The digital probe read 195 degrees Fahrenheit. He nodded, not with visible satisfaction. Exactly. But with the specific internal recognition of a man who has been patient about something and has been proven right. He adjusted the airflow on the smoker's intake vent by a half-turn, replaced the lid, and refilled his water glass from the pitcher on the patio table. He was wearing a faded gray army t-shirt with the sleeves cut off, an old shirt, soft from years of washing, the unit insignia on the left chest barely visible, athletic shorts, worn canvas slip-ons. He had not dressed for anything in particular. He had dressed for a Sunday afternoon in his own backyard, which was the only thing he had planned to do today. He sat back in the Adirondack chair. The Coltrane played at the volume appropriate for a Sunday afternoon, present but not insistent, the way good music should be. He checked his phone. A text from his sister Diane. "Did you start the brisket? I'm bringing potato salad and I need to know what time." He typed back, "Started at 6, done by 4. Don't be late." He put the phone face down on the table beside his water glass. He thought about Diane's potato salad. She made it with celery and a specific amount of mustard that she refused to disclose as a recipe and simply described as "however much feels right," which was not useful information but produced, reliably, an excellent potato salad. He thought about the garden, the pepper seedlings that were already showing their first true leaves, the tomato starts he planned to transplant next weekend, the herbs along the easternmost row that were doing better than he had expected for a first planting. He was not an experienced gardener. He was learning. He found that he liked the learning. He was not thinking about the Korengal Valley. He was not thinking about Kandahar. He was not thinking about the road, or the afternoon, or the dream. Today was a good day. He had learned, slowly and with considerable effort, to be present for good days. Marcus Reeves had served with the 75th Ranger Regiment for 12 years before his separation from the service. First tour, Kunar Province, the Korengal Valley, 14 months of operations in terrain that had a specific or well-earned nickname among the men who served there. Terrain that was beautiful and deadly in roughly equal proportion, and that Marcus still thought about sometimes when he was somewhere very quiet. Second tour, Kandahar province, a different kind of fighting, more complex in its geography and more ambiguous in its objectives. The kind of tour that gave a man a bronze star and a specific recurring dream and a new understanding of the relationship between patience and outcome. He had come home from the second tour as a captain. He had spent 2 years after separating doing tactical advisory work for a defense contractor, living frugally, saving methodically, planning for exactly this: a house with his name on the deed and a backyard where he could grow things and cook things and sit in a wooden chair on a Sunday afternoon and listen to Coltrane and not have to be anywhere or anyone in particular. There were things about Marcus that a person watching him in the backyard would register without necessarily understanding what they were seeing. He had backed his truck into the garage every time he had driven it since moving in. Not consciously, just automatically. The accumulated habit of a man trained to think about exit geometry. When a dog barked 2 houses down, his attention moved to the sound and assessed it and filed it away in under 2 seconds. Without his face changing. On his left forearm, below the cut sleeve of the army shirt, a pale scar ran diagonally across the muscle, about 3 inches, slightly raised. He never explained it. It was not the kind of scar that came with a story he told at parties. He wore no watch. He had worn one for 12 years and had stopped the month after he separated. A small and private declaration of something he still did not have a precise word for. He had been in the neighborhood for 3 weeks. The texture of those 3 weeks was specific and worth noting. The first morning, walking to the mailbox at 7 a.m., he had nodded to a man walking a golden retriever on the opposite sidewalk. The man had kept walking without acknowledging him. Not hostile, not deliberate, simply absent. The specific kind of not seeing that Marcus recognized with the immediate. Complete recognition of something he had seen many times before. He had filed it and moved on. The second week, on a Wednesday evening, he had waved to Vera Colton from his driveway. She had been standing on her front porch at 410 Birchwood, directly next door, with a coffee mug, looking in his direction, not at him, exactly, but in his direction. In the way that someone standing on their front porch might look at the neighborhood generally. He had raised his hand. She had not raised hers. She had turned and gone inside. He had noted this. He had gone inside, come back out with a camera mount and a drill, and spent 45 minutes the following Saturday completing the camera installation he had already planned but had not yet finished. Not because he was afraid, because he was prepared. And preparation was a different thing from fear, and he had been making that distinction his entire adult life. On the patio table, beside the water glass and the phone. Coltrane continued. The afternoon was warm and still. The hickory smoke rose patient and steady into the blue Ohio sky. Then he heard the metallic clatter of the gate latch. Craig Dunbar was 43 years old and had been a police officer in Harwick Estates for 12 years. He had grown up 3 blocks from Birchwood Avenue, a house his parents had owned for 28 years before selling it when they retired to Florida. A house he had walked past on patrol more times than he could count. A house that he thought of, when he thought of it at all, as evidence that this neighborhood had once been a certain way, and that it was his job to maintain some version of that way against the various pressures that worked against it. He had not articulated this belief to himself in those terms. He did not think of himself as a man with a prejudice. He thought of himself as a man with a well-developed sense of what fit and what didn't, a professional instinct, sharpened over 12 years of patrol, that allowed him to identify situations that required his attention. He had a word for the feeling that drove these situations. Not a slur, not even a term he would have used out loud with someone he didn't fully trust. The word was displacement. a quiet, self-justifying certainty that certain people in certain places represented an error that he had the authority and the obligation to address. He had joined the force at 31, after a decade in construction management that had provided adequate income and no particular sense of purpose. The badge had provided the purpose. He had found, almost immediately, that the badge could be used in exactly the way he needed it to be used, as an instrument for the restoration of an order that his private worldview required. He had been doing this for 12 years. He had not been stopped. He had not been stopped because of Captain Roy Haller. Haller had been with the Harwick Estates PD for 23 years when Dunbar joined, and he operated according to a management philosophy that could be summarized simply: officers who kept their behavior within certain parameters, and who understood what those parameters were, would be protected. The parameters were never written down and never explicitly communicated. They were demonstrated, over time, through the specific outcomes of the complaint review process, through the 14 complaints that had been filed against Dunbar over 12 years and the 14 dismissals that had followed, all reviewed by Haller, all resolved within an average of 9 days, all using language so similar across the 14 decisions that a careful reader might recognize a template. Dunbar had tested the parameters carefully in his first years, finding their edges, learning what was covered and what wasn't. He had found the parameters to be generous. He had found them to be reliable. He had stopped thinking about them consciously. The way a driver on a familiar road stops thinking about the turns, they were simply there, and he navigated within them automatically. He had also learned, over those 12 years, to read community tip calls with a specific flexibility, to hear in a call what he already believed, and to use the call as a procedural anchor for a response he had already decided on. When Vera Colton called dispatch to report a suspicious individual at 412 Birchwood, Dunbar heard confirmation of something he already knew. He did not need the address checked. He did not need the property records. He had Vera Colton's 32 years on the street, and that was sufficient. Vera Colton was 67 years old and had lived at 410 Birchwood Avenue since 1991. She was not a cruel woman. She was not someone who thought of herself as prejudiced. She would have rejected the characterization with genuine indignation and with a list of evidence she considered compelling. She believed in civic responsibility. She believed in neighborhood safety. She believed, with a sincerity that made her genuinely difficult to argue with, that she had called the police because something had seemed wrong and it was the right thing to do when something seemed wrong. She had known the house at 412 had sold. She had asked around and been told the new owner was a single man, military background, no family visible yet. When she heard the jazz from his backyard on that Sunday afternoon and smelled the smoke from the smoker and looked through the gap in the kitchen curtains and saw a black man tending a grill in the backyard of a house she had watched sit empty for 3 weeks, something in her assessment did not compute. She did not examine the assessment. She picked up the phone. She waited for the dispatcher to connect. And while she waited, she watched Marcus through the gap in the curtains. She watched him lift the lid of the smoker. She watched him insert a probe and read the result and replace the lid with the focused, knowledgeable attention of someone who had been doing this for hours and knew exactly what he was doing. She watched him walk to the patio table, refill a glass, sit in a wooden chair. She watched him pick up his phone and read something and type a response and put the phone back down. She watched all of this for 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Then she told the dispatcher, "He appears to be trespassing." Danny Ortega was 24 years old and 5 months out of the academy. He had been assigned to Craig Dunbar as his field training officer 4 weeks ago. And in those 4 weeks, he had been keeping a list in his head, not written down, not anywhere that could be found, just carried, of stops that had troubled him, stops that did not have the shape of legitimate police work, stops that followed a pattern he recognized from his training materials, from the case studies his professors had assembled, from the specific examples used to illustrate what unconstitutional policing looked like in practice. He had not acted on this list. He was 5 months out of the academy. He was on probation. He did not know what acting on it would mean for the career he had spent 3 years preparing for. But he was also his mother's son. And his mother, who had worked as a school administrator in a district with 2 predominantly minority high schools for 22 years, and had very specific and very accurately calibrated opinions about the relationship between institutions and the people those institutions were supposed to serve, had raised him with a particular instruction that he had carried into every professional situation since. When something is wrong and you know it's wrong, you don't get to pretend you don't know. He had not pretended not to know. He had simply, for 4 weeks, not known what to do with the knowing. When Dunbar threw the cruiser into gear and said what he said about Vera Colton, Ortega read the dispatch record twice. He did not say, "What's suspicious about someone in their own backyard?" He stared through the windshield, but as the cruiser turned onto Birchwood, he reached into his left breast pocket and took out his personal phone. He opened the voice memo application. He stared at the screen for 3 seconds. He pressed record. He put the phone back in his breast pocket. He did not know if what he was doing was right or wrong or legal or career-ending. He only knew that something in the dispatch record and the acceleration of the cruiser and the set of Dunbar's jaw told him that something was about to happen that should not happen without a record, and that he was the only person in a position to make the record, and that if he didn't do it now, there would be no second chance. The cruiser turned onto Birchwood Avenue. The houses passed on both sides. The oak trees made their green tunnel in the afternoon light. Dunbar did not stop at the front door. He did not ring the doorbell or knock, did not pause at the porch to call out, did not take any of the procedural steps that would have been appropriate for a welfare check or a trespassing call that might, plausibly, involve an uncertain situation. He walked with purpose and speed down the right side of the house, past the narrow strip of grass between the foundation plantings and the fence line, to the privacy gate at the rear corner of the property. The gate was a solid wood panel, 6 feet high, with a wrought iron latch mechanism on the inside. From the outside, the latch was accessible only by reaching over the top of the fence or through a gap that did not exist. Dunbar reached over the top of the fence, a motion that required him to extend his right arm over the top rail, find the latch on the interior side, and flip it upward. It took less than 3 seconds. It was, under clearly established constitutional law, an unlawful entry onto curtilage, private property immediately surrounding a residence, protected by the Fourth Amendment with the same force as the interior of the home itself. The curtilage doctrine was not a recent or ambiguous legal development. It had been reaffirmed by the Supreme Court as recently as 2013 in Florida versus Jardines, a case taught in the first semester of every law enforcement training program in the country. Dunbar flipped the latch. He pushed the gate open. He stepped onto Marcus Reeves's property. Ortega, 2 steps behind, opened his mouth. He closed it. He followed. In the backyard, Marcus heard the latch before he saw the officers. The specific metallic sound of it, which he had heard many times in 3 weeks because it was the sound of his own gate, his own access point, the sound of a mechanism he had installed and maintained. His military-trained situational awareness activated without decision. The Coltrane faded to background. He set the tongs on the side table of the smoker. He turned. Dunbar rounded the corner. He took in the sight of Marcus, tall, broad-shouldered, black, standing by a smoker in his own backyard, and his posture changed in the same instant. Not gradually, immediately. The body language of a man whose suspicion has been confirmed by a visual that contains no actual information beyond what he already decided it contained. His right hand moved to his holster, not drawing, just resting. the specific physical punctuation of a man reminding another person of the power differential he intends to maintain. "Hey, drop what's in your hand right now." Marcus looked at the tongs. He set them on the side table, slowly, deliberately, without any sudden motion, and turned back to face the officers. His face was entirely still, not the stillness of fear, and not the stillness of performance. The stillness of a man who had been in situations where his face had to communicate exactly nothing and had practiced this so many times it had become default. "Can I help you, officers?" "Step away from the grill. Hands where I can see them." "I asked how I can help you." A pause. Level. Unhurried. "You're standing in my backyard." This last sentence landed on Dunbar in a specific way. He had expected a different response, the particular combination of uncertainty and submission that his experience told him accompanied people who knew they were in the wrong place. He had expected eyes that shifted away, a body that angled toward smaller, language that sought to appease. Marcus's body was straight and his eyes were direct, and his language was the language of a man correcting a factual error. "You're standing in my backyard," as if this were simply true, which it was. Dunbar's disorientation lasted less than 3 seconds before it converted to aggression, because aggression was the tool that had always worked when the script wasn't being followed. "This isn't your backyard. I closed on this house 22 days ago. I don't care what story you're running. We got a call about a trespasser at this property. You need to produce identification right now." "Officer," Marcus said, his voice not louder, not sharper, but with a precision that had not been present before. "I am standing on my own private property. I am cooking dinner. I have not committed any crime, and there is no reasonable, articulable suspicion that I have committed a crime. You entered through a locked gate by reaching over my fence to flip the interior latch. Under the Fourth Amendment's curtilage doctrine, you are currently on my protected property without a warrant, without exigent circumstances, and without probable cause. I am not going to produce identification for an unlawful detention." Ortega was standing near the gate. He was looking at the backyard, at the smoker, at the garden along the fence, the fresh-turned soil and the green shoots, the patio table with the water glass, and the phone and the speaker still playing. He was looking at the Adirondack chair. He was looking at everything that said, "A man lives here, has been living here, belongs here." He looked at Dunbar. He said, "Craig, we should run the address." 30 seconds. Dunbar did not look at him. "I've got a witness report." "The address." "Craig, watch the perimeter." Ortega shut up, but his hand moved to his left breast pocket, the pocket where the phone was, where the voice memo was recording, and stayed there for a moment, pressing lightly against the fabric, as if checking that it was still there. It was still there. Dunbar stepped into Marcus's personal space. He was a large man, 6 feet, 210 pounds, but Marcus was taller by 2 inches and broader across the shoulders, and the proximity seemed to agitate Dunbar rather than intimidate Marcus, which was not the dynamic Dunbar was accustomed to and which added its own accelerant to what was already burning. He used the word, said quietly, close to Marcus's face, with the ease of a man who had used it before and had never faced a consequence for using it. Not shouted, not even emphasized, just placed, like a hand on a table. Marcus registered it with the specific, cataloging attention of someone building a record, his jaw tightened by a fraction, a motion so small that only a person watching his face with close attention would have caught it, and Ortega was watching with exactly that attention. His training overrode everything else in less than a second. Not suppression, documentation. He ran the calculation. He had run it before, in different places, under different circumstances, with different variables but the same essential structure. What is the cost of the wrong response? And is there a response that achieves the necessary outcome without paying that cost? He assessed Dunbar's stance. Weight too far forward. Holster hand tense rather than ready. Emotional rather than tactical. He assessed Ortega, visibly conflicted. Hand on his pocket. Not a threat. Possibly the most important person in this backyard for reasons Dunbar could not see. He assessed the situation in full. A backyard in Ohio, a man with a badge, a black man who would be described in every subsequent report in whatever language served the arresting officer's narrative unless there was a record that said otherwise. He had survived 2 combat tours in Afghanistan. He was not going to give a 12-year beat cop the power to write the story of what happened here. He uncrossed his arms. He held both hands open, visible, empty. He said, "My wallet is inside the house on the kitchen counter. I'm not going to retrieve it because I do not consent to this detention. If you believe you have the legal authority to arrest me for cooking dinner in my own backyard, then exercise it. But I want you to understand, clearly and on record, that you are making a catastrophic mistake." Dunbar grabbed his left arm. The grip was hard. The grip of a man asserting that physical contact is itself a form of argument, that it settles debates that words do not settle. Marcus offered no resistance. He absorbed the grip and went entirely still. The specific, complete compliance of someone who has decided that the fight happens in a different arena. Ortega moved forward. He said, "Craig, wait. We can run the address from dispatch right now." "Grab his other arm." "Ortega, now." Ortega looked at Marcus. Marcus looked back at him. Not pleading, not demanding, just looking, with the direct and level attention of a man who was reading another man's face and finding something worth reading. Ortega moved to Marcus's right side. He took the arm. He was the one who clicked the second cuff shut, his hands not entirely steady, the metal ratcheting down into place. As the cuffs locked, Marcus turned his head slightly and found Ortega's eyes. "Pay attention to what is happening right now," he said, quietly enough that Dunbar could not hear him over his own movement and noise. "Memorize the exact time. Memorize every word that was said. When this goes to deposition, and it will, your career will depend entirely on whether you tell the truth about what you saw your partner do today." Ortega said nothing. His hand moved to his left breast pocket and rested there. And his expression was the expression of a man who has made a decision, but has not yet finished making it. Marcus felt the press of the cuffs, tight, deliberately so. The specific punishing tightness of a man communicating through metal rather than language. He noted the pressure. He noted the position. He noted the time on the clock visible through the kitchen window. He was building the case, and he had been building it since the moment he heard the latch. They marched him through the side gate, Dunbar in front, one hand on Marcus's left arm, Ortega a half step behind, and as they rounded the corner of the house onto the front driveway. Marcus looked back once. The offset smoker sat on the patio, steady and patient, producing its ribbon of hickory smoke into the July afternoon. The brisket inside had been cooking for 9 hours and 38 minutes. The temperature was holding at 195 degrees Fahrenheit. He had set the intake vent at the precise position to maintain that range for another 2 hours without adjustment. The garden along the south fence showed its green shoots, unhurried and indifferent to what was happening on the other side of the yard. The Adirondack chair sat at the edge of the patio with the water glass on the table beside it, and Diane's text still waiting on the phone beside the glass. "Started at 6, done by 4, don't be late." Nobody turned off the smoker. Nobody closed the lid. The backyard simply continued being the backyard, with everything in it exactly as Marcus had left it, as if the space were waiting, with the patient, unhurried confidence of something that knew the owner would be back, for the person who belonged there to return. Marcus filed the image. He would carry it with him for the next several hours, and it would keep him focused in the way that certain images keep certain kinds of people focused, not as fuel for anger, but as a fixed point, a specific and concrete reminder of what was being done and what therefore needed to be done in response. The neighbors came out. The man across the street had been washing his car in the driveway, an older man, gray-haired, work jacket, and he stopped when he saw the cruiser and the handcuffed man and the two officers emerging from the side of the house. He stood with the hose in his hand and watched. A woman 2 houses down had been walking a retriever, and she stopped at the corner, the dog sitting automatically at her feet. 2 children on bicycles came around the bend at the end of the block and braked at the sight of the police activity, hovering at a safe distance, watching with the specific attentiveness of children witnessing something they do not have the context to interpret. And on the front porch of 410 Birchwood, directly next door, the porch where Marcus had seen her standing 3 times in 3 weeks and where she had twice turned and gone inside without acknowledging him, Vera Colton stood with her arms crossed. Her expression was the specific expression of a woman who has done what she believes was her civic duty and who is watching the confirmation of that belief unfold before her. There was satisfaction in it, not cruelty. She was not cruel, but the satisfied vindication of someone whose assessment had been validated. Marcus walked with his head up and his posture straight. He did not look at the retrievers or the children or the man with the hose. He looked ahead, at the cruiser, at the destination. But as he passed the shared fence line between 412 and 410 Birchwood Avenue, the 3 feet of grass between his property line and hers, he turned his head and looked directly at Vera Colton. He did not say anything. He simply looked at her with the specific, level attention of a man identifying and noting a variable in an operational environment for exactly 4 seconds. Vera Colton held his gaze for 2 of those 4 seconds. Then she looked away. She would tell herself later that she looked away because she was finished watching, that there was nothing more to see. But the truth was that something in those 4 seconds had lodged in her chest with the specific discomfort of a thing that she did not have the language to name, but that she could not dismiss. And it would remain there for a long time. Across the street, the man with the hose was Frank Kowalski, 61 years old, retired Army, 22 years served, 2 tours in the First Gulf War, lived at 415 Birchwood for 14 years. He had seen the moving truck arrive 3 weeks ago at 412. He had thought about going over to introduce himself, had thought about it specifically because of the military bearing he had observed in the new neighbor from across the street, the way he moved and the way he assessed a space, and had not done it, for reasons he could not fully articulate except that it had not quite seemed like the right moment yet. He watched the cruiser pull away from the curb with Marcus in the back seat. He stood in his driveway for a moment after it had turned the corner and disappeared. Then he went inside. He found the number for the Harwick Estates Police Department's non-emergency line. He called it. He said that he was Frank Kowalski at 415 Birchwood, and that he had just watched the police take the man from 412 away in handcuffs, and that the man from 412 appeared to be the owner of the house and had been in his own backyard, and that he wanted this call documented. The dispatcher said she would note it. Kowalski hung up. He stood in his kitchen looking at the counter for a moment. Then he looked out the window at the house across the street, the white exterior, the dark blue shutters, the side gate still ajar from where they had brought Marcus through. He felt the specific weight of a decision made too late and a different decision that was just now beginning. In the back seat of the cruiser, Marcus leaned his head against the hard plastic partition. The air in the back was stifling. The air conditioning was broken and had evidently been broken for some time. the back smelling of heat and old plastic and the accumulated residue of everyone who had ever sat in this particular cage. His wrists were pinched by the tight cuffs. He ignored this. He had been trained to manage physical discomfort, and he was managing it. Through the plexiglass divider, he watched Dunbar in the driver's seat, the set of his shoulders, the specific quality of his posture, the self-satisfied stillness of a man whose internal accounting had just resolved in his favor. Dunbar was not thinking about probable cause or curtilage or the county property records. He was thinking about having won. "That's how you handle these situations," Dunbar said to Ortega, as the cruiser turned onto the main road toward the department. "You show them that the street has rules. Give them an inch, and they think they own the whole block." Ortega said nothing. He stared through the passenger window. His left hand was in his breast pocket, and he was pressing it lightly against the fabric, confirming the presence of the phone. In the back seat, Marcus was not thinking about Dunbar. He was reviewing the camera angles he had memorized when he installed the system 3 Saturdays ago. He was thinking about the latch, the specific, documented moment of the arm reaching over the fence. He was thinking about a phone number he had not dialed in 2 years, a number he carried without writing it down because James Whitfield had told him, over coffee in a Kabul cantonment in 2017, that the best clients were the ones who kept his number the way soldiers kept certain tools, ready, available, not expected, but always there. He was thinking about how long it would take Whitfield to answer on a Sunday afternoon. He was not afraid. He was the most focused he had been since the day he separated from the service. The Harwick Estates Police Department occupied a building on Route 9 that had been built in 1987 and had not been meaningfully renovated since 1994. The holding area was a room at the back of the first floor with fluorescent lighting that buzzed at a frequency just below the threshold of conscious notice, and linoleum floors that had been cleaned so many times the pattern had worn away in the high traffic areas. Steel benches were bolted to the wall at 4-foot intervals, each with a bracket for securing restraints. Marcus sat on the bench with the left cuff attached to the wall bracket and the right hanging free. Dunbar had uncuffed his right wrist briefly at the cruiser to pat him down, then reattached it to the bracket on entry. His posture was straight. It was the posture he had held at every briefing, in every FOB, in every operational context of his 12-year career, and it was the posture he would hold here, in this room, because it was the only posture he knew how to maintain, and because it communicated, to anyone paying attention, something specific and accurate about the nature of the man sitting on this bench. He had not spoken a word since the cruiser. He looked at the clock on the institutional wall. 4:07 p.m. He noted it. He looked at the positions of the room's cameras, one in the upper right corner covering the door and most of the bench area, one in the upper left covering the remaining bench space and the window to the hallway. He looked at the room's dimensions. He looked at the light. He filed all of it and waited. At the booking counter, Sergeant Tom Briggs looked up from his terminal as Dunbar came through the door with Ortega trailing. Briggs had 20 years on the job, 20 years of booking sheets and complaint forms, and the specific, accumulating institutional knowledge of a man who had seen the full range of what a police department could do right and wrong. He had permanent bags under his eyes and a receding hairline and an expression of such comprehensive fatigue that it had become simply his face, the face he wore regardless of what he was thinking. He looked at Dunbar. He looked at the arrest report Dunbar was carrying. He looked through the window at the man on the bench, the posture, the stillness, the specific quality of a man who was waiting rather than detained. If you knew how to read that distinction. What have we got? Trespassing, failure to identify, resisting, Dunbar said, dropping the report on the counter. Picked him up at a property on Birchwood. Beatrice Gable, Vera Colton. Sorry, she called it in. 32 years on that street. Said the guy doesn't belong. Briggs picked up the report. He read it. He set it down. He said, "Birchwood property. You run the address?" "Had a witness report." "Did you run the address?" "Craig?" The guy was uncooperative, refused to show ID, claimed his wallet was... "I have a direct terminal to the county clerk," Briggs said. 30 seconds. He typed. The room was quiet except for the keys and the fluorescent buzz. Ortega stood near the door with his hands at his sides. Dunbar shifted his weight. The clock on the wall moved from 4:08 to 4:09. Briggs read his screen. He scrolled. He read again. His hands stopped moving over the keyboard. He did not look up immediately. He was doing the arithmetic that 20-year sergeants do when they see something on a screen that tells them the next several days are going to be very different from the last several days. "Craig," he said. His voice had dropped to the specific register of a man trying to deliver information in a way that allows for some controlled landing. "The deed for 412 Birchwood was recorded 22 days ago. The registered owner is Marcus Alexander Reeves." Dunbar's expression did not collapse. It hardened, the specific hardening of a man whose internal narrative is being challenged by external fact and who is refusing the challenge. He could have looked it up online, used the name as a cover. "Craig, the guy doesn't fit. Let him call his attorney." Briggs said it flatly, with the tone of a statement that was not going to be argued with. "Right now, before this gets any worse than it already is." Dunbar uncuffed Marcus's right wrist from the bracket and shoved a receiver across the desk. Marcus picked it up. He dialed from memory, a number he had carried for 2 years without writing it down. A number attached to a man who had once sat across from him in a cantonment in Kabul and said, "If the day ever comes when you need someone to take apart a bureaucratic injustice piece by piece and rebuild it into a liability, call me." It rang twice. "Whitfield? James? It's Marcus Reeves." A brief pause, not surprise, but the specific quality of a man shifting modes. "Marcus, where are you?" "Harwick Estates Police Department. I've been arrested for barbecuing in my own backyard." 3 seconds of silence. Then, with the flat precision of a man moving through a checklist, name of the arresting officer. "Dunbar, Craig Dunbar. Injuries? Wrists, cuffs applied with deliberate excess tightness. I've documented the pressure marks. Don't answer any questions. Don't explain anything to anyone. Sit." "Already sitting. 40 minutes?" Marcus hung up. He looked at Briggs. "My attorney is on his way. I won't be answering questions." A pause. "I'd suggest you call Chief Farrow. He's going to want to be awake for what comes next." Briggs looked at him for a moment. The posture, the calm, the specific quality of a man who was not making a threat, but stating a logistical fact. Then Briggs picked up his phone. In the bullpen, Dunbar sat at his desk and worked on the arrest report. He typed with focused attention, choosing his words with the practiced care of a man who had written 14 complaint-adjacent documents in 12 years and knew which language held up and which didn't. Subject refused lawful order to produce identification. Subject made threatening statements. Subject displayed aggressive posture. He was constructing the narrative. He was good at constructing the narrative. Ortega sat at the adjacent desk. His terminal was open, but he was not looking at it. He was looking at his hands, folded on the desk. His personal phone was in his breast pocket with the voice memo still running. He had not reviewed it, had not stopped it, was not certain it had captured everything, was not certain it was legal, was not certain of anything except that he had made the recording and that what he did with it next would define something about who he was in a way that he could not yet see the full shape of. He took out his phone. He opened his email. He navigated to his contacts and found a name he had not contacted since graduation. Professor Renata Vega, formerly of the Federal Prosecutor's Office, currently teaching criminal procedure at the State University. On the last day of class, she had said, "If you ever find yourself in a situation where you don't know who to call me." He typed 3 sentences. He hit send. He put the phone away. He looked at Dunbar, who was still typing, still constructing the narrative, still entirely certain that the narrative would hold. Ortega was not certain of that. James Whitfield walked through the front door of the Harwick Estates PD at 4:51 p.m. He was 54 years old, and he moved through the space the way a surgeon moves through a hospital, with the specific, unhurried authority of a man for whom the environment holds no particular mystery, and whose confidence derives not from aggression, but from the comprehensive familiarity of someone who has done this work in every variation it has to offer. He wore a tailored dark suit, not remarkable, not ostentatious, simply exact, and carried a slim leather briefcase that had been inside 37 federal courtrooms. He had been a JAG officer for 6 years before entering private practice, and before that, he had been many things. But what he was now, at 54, was one of the 3 or 4 best civil rights litigators in the state of Ohio. He did not greet the desk sergeant. He said, "James Whitfield, I'm here for Marcus Reeves." Briggs pointed to the holding area. Whitfield went directly there. He pulled a chair from the hallway, positioned it beside the bench, opened his briefcase, took out a legal pad, and looked at Marcus. "Tell me everything in sequence, times where you have them." Marcus spoke for 11 minutes. He did not editorialize. He did not raise his voice. He reported the sequence in order: the gate latch, the approach, the exchange, the word, the handcuffs, the tightness, the time. He described Ortega's 3 attempts to slow Dunbar and the hand that went to the breast pocket, and the specific quality of the younger officer's face at the moment the cuffs locked. When he finished, he said, "There's a 4K camera on the gate. It was recording from before they came through." Whitfield looked up from his legal pad. "Continuous recording?" "Cloud uploaded. Real time. Full coverage from approximately 15 feet before the gate to the patio area." Whitfield was quiet for a moment. Then he wrote something on his legal pad and underlined it. "Does the camera cover the neighbor's window?" he asked. "Partially. The patio camera has a wide angle. The fence gap on the north side, her kitchen window is visible through it." Whitfield nodded slowly. "We're going to need that footage preserved immediately. I've already sent a preservation notification to the cloud service from my phone." Marcus paused. "I did it in the cruiser." Chief William Farrow arrived at the precinct at 5:04 p.m., 14 minutes after Briggs's call, still in weekend clothes, khakis, a polo shirt, which was an accurate measure of how quickly he had moved. He was 58 years old and 25 years into a career that had involved, among other things, 2 previous misconduct settlements that had been managed quietly and expensively. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had learned, over 25 years, the specific skill of absorbing problems before they became public, and who was very good at this skill, and who was currently walking into a situation in which the skill was going to be inadequate. He walked into the holding area and saw James Whitfield's briefcase open on the chair. He stopped. He looked at Marcus on the bench. He looked at the briefcase. He looked at Whitfield. Who was standing and who said, without preface or greeting, "Chief Farrow, your officer reached over a locked privacy fence to flip the interior latch of my client's gate." Florida versus Jardines, clearly established curtilage doctrine. He had no warrant, no exigent circumstances, no articulable probable cause. He arrested my client for standing in his own backyard based on a tip call from a neighbor who didn't recognize him. He applied handcuffs with deliberate excess tightness to a fully compliant detainee. And the entire interaction was captured on my client's 4K security system, which was recording from before your officer reached over the fence. He produced a single sheet from his briefcase, the county deed, accessed from his phone during the drive. The deed has been filed for 22 days. My client's name is on it. Farrow took the deed. He read it. He looked at Dunbar, who had followed him in and was standing in the doorway with the expression of a man whose certainty is, for the first time, showing cracks. Farrow said, very quietly, "Go home. Craig." "Chief, the guy was..." "Go. Home." Dunbar looked at Farrow. He looked at Whitfield. He looked at Marcus, who was sitting on the bench looking at no one in particular, his posture as straight as it had been at any point in the afternoon. He left. A patrol officer removed the cuff from Marcus's left wrist. Marcus brought both arms in front of him and looked at his wrists, the marks the metal had left, the specific impressions of the ratchet mechanism on both sides. He did not rub them. He looked at them with the clinical attention of documentation, noting the depth and the distribution, then looked up. "Chief Farrow," he said, "I want to be precise about what happened this afternoon. Your officer entered my property through a locked gate without a warrant. He threatened me with physical force for asserting my legal rights. He applied handcuffs with deliberate excess tightness after I was fully compliant and offered no resistance. And he used, in my backyard, a specific word that I will describe in complete detail during the proceedings." Farrow listened with his jaw set and his hands clasped in front of him. He began. "I'd advise against completing that sentence without counsel," Whitfield said, pleasantly. "We'll file the formal complaint tomorrow morning. Tonight. I'm taking my client home." Marcus picked up his house keys and phone from the evidence tray. He walked out of the Harwick Estates Police Department and into the evening air, which was warm and smelled of nothing in particular and was the air of a free man on a Sunday evening, which was what he was. He thought about the brisket. He had been gone for approximately 2 hours. The smoker would have maintained temperature on the low hold setting. He had set it before leaving the backyard for exactly this reason. Because a man who plans for contingencies does not walk away from a 9-hour smoke without considering what happens if he can't get back to it when expected. The internal temp was probably sitting at 185 now. 20 more minutes at operating temperature and it would be exactly where it needed to be. He got in Whitfield's car and thought about brisket and camera angles and the look on Ortega's face when the cuffs locked, and he was, if anything, entirely calm. Marcus got home at 8:22 p.m. He parked in the garage, backed in, the habit of a decade and a half. He walked through the house to the back door and out onto the patio. The smoker was running on its low hold setting, producing a thin, steady ribbon of smoke, the temperature gauge reading 183 degrees Fahrenheit. He opened the lid, inserted the probe, read 178 degrees Fahrenheit at the center of the brisket, slightly under ideal, but workable. He adjusted the intake vent 2 full turns, added a small amount of fuel to the firebox, and replaced the lid. 25 minutes at operating temp, and it would be ready. He sat in the Adirondack chair. He looked at the backyard in the evening light, the garden, the fence, the camera on the upper right corner of the gate. He picked up his phone. He opened the security system app. He selected simultaneous playback for the rear gate camera and the patio camera, and set the timestamp to 3:38 p.m., 3 minutes before he had heard the latch. He watched for 9 minutes without speaking. The footage was 4K. This had been a deliberate decision. He had paid the premium specifically because his experience had taught him that the resolution at which evidence was captured determined, in many practical ways, the resolution at which accountability was possible. Every detail was clear. The arm coming over the fence, the specific motion of the hand finding the interior latch, the gate swinging inward, Dunbar rounding the corner of the patio with his hand already on the holster, already, before he had come far enough around the corner to see anything, before any visual assessment of any situation had been possible. The word, which did not have a visual component, but for which the context was unambiguous, the handcuffs going on, Ortega's face, captured in the patio camera's wide angle, the sequence of emotions visible in his expression across the 11 minutes of the confrontation, the initial discomfort, the 3 attempts to slow Dunbar, the specific quality of his face at the moment he clicked the cuff shut and heard what Marcus said to him. And something else, something Marcus had not known about when he was standing in the backyard. The patio camera had a wider angle than Marcus had consciously registered when selecting it, a 165-degree field, covering not just the patio area and the gate approach, but through the gap between the fence slats on the north side, a partial view of the second-story window of 410 Birchwood. In the footage, at a timestamp of 3:21 p.m., 20 minutes before Dunbar arrived, 17 minutes before dispatch received Vera Colton's call, a figure was visible in that window, standing slightly back from the glass, looking through the gap in the curtains, in the specific body language of someone who believed they were not visible from below. The figure stood at the window for 4 minutes and 23 seconds. Marcus verified this by marking the timestamps, 4 minutes and 23 seconds of watching. Then the figure moved away from the window. At 3:29 p.m., the dispatch record showed Vera Colton's call was received. At 3:41 p.m., the front driveway camera, the one covering the approach to the house, showed Dunbar's cruiser pulling to the curb. Marcus watched this sequence twice. He made timestamps of the key moments and sent them to Whitfield with a single message. Footage is complete. You need to see the patio camera, specifically the timestamps 15:21 to 15:26. Call me when you're up. He put the phone down. He sat in the Adirondack chair in the evening light and looked at the garden. He was not surprised. He had been prepared. But there was a difference between preparation and mention, and what he had just watched documented. In 4 minutes and 23 seconds of 4K footage, the specific decision that had set this afternoon in motion. He called Diane. "Dinner is pushed to tomorrow," he said. "Brisket is almost ready, but I have some things to handle tonight." A silence. "Marcus, what happened?" "I'm fine. I'll tell you everything tomorrow." "Tell me now." "Diane." He heard her breath on the other end, the specific quality of a sister who knows her brother's voice in every register and is reading this one accurately and is choosing, out of the particular trust that comes from a lifetime of knowing someone, to accept his assessment even when she does not fully believe it. "Tomorrow," she said. "And it better be brisket." "It will be brisket," he said. At 9:47 p.m., James Whitfield's office line received a voicemail. The caller identified himself only as an officer who was present at the Birchwood Avenue call this afternoon. His voice was young and slightly unsteady. He said he had made an audio recording on his personal phone during the backyard interaction. He said he did not know what to do with it. He said he had emailed a former professor, a retired federal prosecutor, for guidance, and he was going to do whatever she told him. He left a callback number. Whitfield listened to the voicemail at 10:09 p.m. He called Marcus immediately. "Tell me about the younger officer." Marcus described Ortega, the 3 attempts, the hand on the pocket, the face at the cuff click. "He made a recording," Whitfield said. "Yes?" Did you know in the backyard? I suspected. I saw the pocket motion. I know what a voice memo activation looks like. Between the camera and the audio, Whitfield paused. Marcus, I need you to understand what we have here. I understand what we have, Marcus said. I had it before I walked out the gate. A pause. Then Whitfield. I'll file Monday morning. File everything, Marcus said. Dunbar, Haller, and the complaint dismissals, and the footage from 3:21 to 3:26, the window. All of it. All of it, Whitfield confirmed. At 10:31 p.m., there was a knock on Marcus's front door. He opened it. Frank Kowalski stood on the porch, 61 years old, work jacket, the faded patch of the 82nd Airborne on the left shoulder. Marcus looked at the patch for a moment. 75th Ranger Regiment, Kowalski said, looking at Marcus's army shirt. 82nd Airborne, Marcus said. I know. I've been meaning to come introduce myself. I should have come over when I saw the moving truck, Kowalski said. He looked at the porch floor. I watched them take you out in cuffs this afternoon. I should have come outside. You called the non-emergency line. Kowalski looked at him. How did you? Front camera. You came outside about 40 seconds after the cruiser left. I pulled the footage tonight. Marcus looked at him steadily. You did something. That counts. They stood on the porch for a moment. The evening was warm. The neighborhood was quiet. Down the street, 410 Birchwood was dark. You eaten? Marcus said. I've got a brisket that's been going since 6 this morning. Something in Kowalski's face, the tension that had been sitting there since mid-afternoon, shifted. No, he said. I haven't eaten. Marcus opened the door wider. Kowalski came in. They went through the house to the back door and out onto the patio, where the smoker was holding at 195 degrees Fahrenheit, and the backyard was quiet, and the hickory smoke rose into the night air with the patient. Unhurried consistency of something that had simply waited for the right moment and had been right about the waiting. Monday morning, 8 a.m. James Whitfield filed the formal civil rights complaint at the federal courthouse, along with a notice of preservation for all relevant department records, a formal demand for Dunbar's complete personnel file and complaint history, and a preservation notice specifically for Captain Roy Haller's IA review records for the preceding 12 years. At 8:14 a.m., a local news station received a tip about a 4K security camera footage from a property on Birchwood Avenue. By 8:21 a.m., the footage had been obtained through the public court filing. By 8:47 a.m., the station had aired the first clip, 13 seconds, showing an officer's arm reaching over a fence to flip an interior latch, followed by 11 minutes of the backyard confrontation, followed by the specific visible tightness of the handcuffs on a man who had been fully compliant throughout. By 9 a.m., 14,000 people had shared it. By 9:30 a.m., it was the top story on 3 national news aggregators. Diane Reeves was in her apartment in Columbus, 40 minutes from Harwick Estates, when her phone produced the notification cascade. A friend had tagged her. She opened the link. She watched the footage. She watched her brother's arm being pulled behind his back in the backyard of his own house, the house she knew he had saved for 11 years to buy, the house he had described to her in a phone call 3 weeks ago with a specific, quiet happiness that she had not heard from him in a long time. She watched his face in the patio camera angle. She had known his face her entire life. She knew it in every register, the face he wore when he was being careful, the face he wore when something was funny, the face he wore when something had been very hard and he was managing the hardness. She knew the face he was wearing in the footage. It was the face of someone who was working. Already working. Already building something out of what was being done to him. She called him. He picked up on the second ring. "I saw it," she said. "I know. Are you?" "I'm fine." She sat in her apartment for 11 minutes after they hung up. Then she got in her car and drove to Harwick Estates. She brought potato salad. It was a Monday, which turned out not to matter at all. By noon on Monday, Chief Farrow had placed Dunbar on unpaid administrative leave. He issued a statement describing the action as a necessary step pending internal affairs review that used, notably, the word deeply twice in 3 sentences. By Wednesday, the IA review had concluded. The 4K footage and Ortega's audio recording, which Ortega had submitted formally on Monday morning, following a 2-hour phone conversation with Professor Vega, who had told him exactly what to do and in exactly what order, gave the review panel no interpretive work to do. The footage was what it was. The audio was what it was. Dunbar was officially terminated at 2:15 p.m. Wednesday. At 3:45 p.m. the same day, Haller was placed on administrative leave. The review of Dunbar's complaint history had expanded, as it was always going to expand once someone with federal subpoena authority looked at it. 14 complaints, 14 dismissals, all reviewed by the same supervisor, all closed within a 9-day average, all using language so similar that a search for the specific phrase "subject failed to comply with lawful orders" returned 11 of the 14 files. This was not a pattern that emerged from careful investigation. It was a pattern that was visible the moment anyone looked. The union held a meeting that lasted 43 minutes. They issued a statement expressing serious concern about the footage. 2 days later, Dunbar received a letter at his home address formally declining legal representation. On Tuesday morning, Craig Dunbar sat in the driveway of his house in his personal vehicle and watched the footage on his phone. He watched it 4 times. Each time, he watched it with a different objective, looking for the angle, the frame, the moment that could be used to support the narrative he had been constructing since Sunday afternoon. He did not find it. The footage did not contain the narrative he was looking for because the narrative he was looking for was not there. What was there was an arm reaching over a fence, a hand going to a holster before a corner was turned, a word said close to a man's face, and handcuffs applied to a man who had not moved. He turned off the phone on the 4th viewing. He looked through his windshield at the house. 9 years in this house, 12 years in this department, 14 complaints absorbed without consequence, a career built on the specific understanding that certain things were permitted if you stayed within certain parameters. He called the union. Voicemail. He called Haller. Voicemail. He called the department's general line and was told, by a voice he recognized, that Captain Haller was unavailable. He sat in the driveway for a long time. The morning was ordinary around him. A neighbor's sprinkler running on a timer, a delivery truck passing at the end of the block, a dog barking 2 houses down. The ordinary morning of a neighborhood that did not yet know that its ordinary was about to change. He sat with the phone in his hand and the footage stopped on the last frame he had watched, his own face, in the patio camera, after the cuffs had gone on, wearing the expression of a man who has won, and he sat with it for a long time. On Thursday of the same week, Vera Colton opened her mailbox and found a certified letter from Whitfield, Okafor and Associates, Civil Rights Litigation. She had been watching the news coverage since Monday morning. She had watched the footage. Her daughter had called on Monday afternoon, voice tight, and said, "Mom, I'm sending you a link and I need you to watch it." And she had watched it and constructed, over 3 days, a version of events in which what she had done was reasonable and defensible, and the product of genuine concern rather than anything else. The letter did not support this construction. It described, in specific and legally precise language, the call she had made to dispatch. It noted, with a timestamp and a camera reference, the 4 minutes and 23 seconds of footage in which she was visible through the kitchen window watching Marcus before she picked up the phone. It described the claims being filed: defamation, civil conspiracy, filing a false police report. It was signed by James Whitfield. She sat down on her front porch steps, the same porch where she had stood with her arms crossed on Sunday afternoon. She held the letter in both hands. The street was quiet. A car passed. Someone's sprinkler activated on a timer. She thought about the 4 seconds. She thought about the way she had looked away. She thought about the 4 minutes and 23 seconds of watching a man tend his smoker in his own backyard before she picked up the phone. And she sat with that. And it was not comfortable. And there was no arrangement of the facts she could construct that made it comfortable. And she sat with that too. On Friday evening, Frank Kowalski sent emails to 17 residents of Birchwood Avenue. The subject line read, "We need to talk about what happened Sunday." 11 people responded that they would attend. 3 said they could not attend but supported the meeting. 2 did not respond. The meeting was held in Kowalski's living room on Saturday morning. Kowalski spoke first. He described what he had seen from across the street. He described the call he had made to the non-emergency line and what it had and hadn't accomplished. He described going to Marcus's door on Sunday night. He said, "I should have come outside when they took him. I stood in my driveway and I watched and I didn't come out. That's mine. I'm not going to do the same thing again." Several of his neighbors nodded. Some looked at their hands. One woman in the back, she had lived at 407 Birchwood for 11 years, said, "I've been trying to figure out what I should have done differently for 5 days." "Me too," said the man beside her. Something in the room moved, the specific movement of a group of people who have been existing in the comfortable arrangement of performed virtue and are arriving, uncomfortably, at the question of what virtue actually requires. Leon Okafor was 44 years old and had been driving the same regional logistics route for 11 years. He was reliable, his supervisor's word, his customer's word, the word that appeared on every annual review in a file cabinet at the depot on Route 12. He showed up. He delivered. He did the work correctly and on time. These were not small things. He knew they were not small things. 2 years ago, on a Tuesday afternoon in October, he had pulled his delivery truck to the curb at the corner of Elm and Whitfield in the residential section of Harwick Estates, the name of the street being, he had later thought, one of the things that made the afternoon feel, in retrospect, like something that had been shaped rather than random. He was checking a delivery address on his manifest. He had been parked for less than 90 seconds when the cruiser appeared. The officer who stepped out was Craig Dunbar. He said Leon matched the description of a robbery suspect. He said this the way a man says something he has decided is true rather than something he has determined is true, with the confidence of a conclusion that preceded the evidence. Leon asked what robbery. Dunbar said it had been reported in the area. Leon asked what area. Dunbar said he was asking the questions here. Dunbar searched the truck for 31 minutes. He found 8 packages in sealed delivery envelopes, 4 bottles of water, a lunch bag, a road atlas that Leon had owned for 7 years and kept in the cab out of habit even though he used his phone for navigation, and a small photograph of Leon's daughter that was taped to the dashboard beside the air conditioning vent. He found nothing that constituted evidence of any crime, because there was no crime, and there had been no robbery, and there was no description that Leon matched, except the description that Dunbar carried inside his head. He filed no stop report. He left no record of the encounter. Leon filed a complaint with the Harwick Estates PD that evening. While the events were still precise in his memory, he sat at his kitchen table and wrote everything out in sequence: the timestamp, the location, the words used, the duration of the search, the absence of any probable cause. He was specific. He was accurate. He mailed it certified the following morning. 9 days later, He received a form letter from the department informing him that his complaint had been reviewed and that no policy violation had been found. He wrote a letter to the city council. He received a form acknowledgement. He wrote a second letter. He received another form acknowledgement. He kept every document, the complaint, the response, the letters, the acknowledgements, the handwritten timeline he had composed the night of the stop, in a manila folder in the filing cabinet beside his desk. He kept it not because he expected it to be useful, but because the act of keeping it was the only act of documentation available to him. And documentation was what he had. 2 years passed. On a Wednesday morning in the week after Marcus's arrest, Leon's cell phone rang. The caller identified herself as a paralegal with Whitfield, Okafor and Associates. She explained that a federal civil rights case had been filed against Officer Craig Dunbar of the Harwick Estates PD, and that in the course of discovery, a pattern of complaint suppression had been identified, and that Leon's complaint was among the records obtained. She said they would like to speak with him, if he was willing. Leon was quiet for a long time after she finished. "I still have the folder," he said. Whitfield's discovery process identified, through Dunbar's personnel file and the Haller complaint review records, 9 additional incidents in 12 years that bore the structural markers of unconstitutional stops, Black or Hispanic individuals, residential areas, stops initiated without documented probable cause, complaints filed, complaints dismissed. Of those 9, 3 could be connected to individuals who were still reachable. 2 of those 3 agreed to be involved. Leon was one. The other was Rosa Delgado, 38 years old, a registered nurse at Harwick County Medical, who had been stopped 3 years ago in the hospital parking lot while walking to her car at the end of a 12-hour shift. Dunbar had told her she fit the description of a shoplifting suspect from a different zip code. Rosa Delgado was 5 feet 2 inches tall, was wearing scrubs, and was carrying a hospital ID badge. She had filed a complaint. It had been dismissed in 7 days. She had also kept records. She had a folder. The week before the civil hearing, Whitfield shared the victim profiles with Marcus in his office. Marcus read through the file without speaking. When he finished, he set it on the table and looked out the window at the street below. He thought about his cameras. He thought about the number memorized rather than written down. He thought about Leon Okafor's folder in a filing cabinet, and Rosa Delgado's records, and the 14 other people who had filed complaints and received form letters. And he sat with the arithmetic of it, the years, the folders, the forms, the cumulative weight of documentation that had been kept by people who had every reason to believe it would never matter to anyone. "I want Leon Okafor to testify before I do," Marcus said. "I'd planned. I want Leon first." He looked at Whitfield. "I had a camera on the gate and your number in my head. Leon had a folder and 2 form letters from City Council. The jury needs to understand both of those things. They need to understand Leon's folder before they hear from me." Whitfield wrote something on his notepad. "Leon first," he said. "And Rosa," Marcus said. After Leon, a USA Diana Ruiz handled the federal criminal charges against Dunbar. Deprivation of rights under color of law, 18 U.S.C. Section 242, assault. She was 39. 8 years in the U.S. Attorney's Office, and she had a reputation among her colleagues for a specific, unhurried thoroughness that other prosecutors sometimes found unnerving and that consistently produced results. The federal civil rights charges against Dunbar were filed in conjunction with the civil suit, which named Dunbar personally, qualified immunity having been denied at the earliest possible stage by a federal judge who reviewed the curtilage violation against the Florida versus Jardines precedent and found the law so clearly established that there was nothing to argue about, and the city of Harwick Estates for failure to supervise. Against Haller, obstruction of justice and conspiracy to deprive persons of their civil rights, built on the documented complaint suppression pattern, 14 complaints, 14 dismissals, templated language, 9-day average resolution, a single reviewer for every case. Both men were tried separately. This account covers the primary proceedings. The civil hearing began on a Monday morning. Ruiz opened without a speech. She played the footage, not a clip, the full 11 minutes. From the arm over the fence to the cruiser leaving the curb. She played it in a courtroom that was at capacity, and the room was quiet for the full 11 minutes. And when it ended, she let the silence sit for 6 seconds. Then she said, "The man standing in that backyard had been a homeowner for 22 days. The deed had his name on it. The smoker had been running since 6 that morning." She sat down. Leon Okafor took the stand on the second day of the hearing. He was wearing a suit he had bought for his daughter's college orientation and had worn twice since, once for her graduation. And now, for this. He sat in the witness box with the specific bearing of a man who has been waiting a long time for a room that would listen and who has decided to use the room fully. He described the delivery truck, the intersection, the 90 seconds of parking, the cruiser's appearance. He described the search, 31 minutes. Everything found and found to contain nothing. He described the form letter. He described the folder. When Ruiz asked him why he had kept the folder for 2 years with no realistic expectation of outcome, he was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table in front of him. Then he looked at the jury. "Because it happened. It happened to me on a street in this city, on a Tuesday afternoon, when I was doing my job. And I knew when I filed that complaint that it was probably going to go nowhere. But it happened. And I was the only person who was going to make sure there was a record of it happening. So, I kept the record." He looked at Marcus across the room. Marcus gave him a small, brief nod. "I kept it for 2 years because I thought it might matter someday. I didn't know when. I didn't know how. I just knew that if I threw it away, then the only version of what happened was the version with no folder." The courtroom was quiet. Rosa Delgado testified the following morning. She was precise and brief. The stop, the parking lot, the scrubs, the badge she was wearing. She described filing the complaint. She described the dismissal. She said, "I went back to work the next day. I parked in the same lot. I walked to the same entrance. Because it was my parking lot and my entrance, and I wasn't going to let one bad stop take those things from me. But I kept the records, because it happened." Danny Ortega took the stand on the third day. He was pale and had not been sleeping well. He played the audio recording, 43 minutes and 9 seconds. From the moment the cruiser stopped on Birchwood to the moment Marcus was put in the back seat. The recording captured everything. The exchange at the gate, the word, the 3 times Ortega said, "Craig, wait," the cuffs, what Marcus said to Ortega when the cuffs locked, when Ruiz asked why he had made the recording. Ortega looked at the table for a moment. "Because I knew what I was watching was wrong, and I wasn't able to stop it. And I thought, if I can't stop it right now, then the most useful thing I can do is make sure there's a record, so that whatever happens next, it happens with the truth available." He received full cooperation immunity. He kept his badge. Marcus took the stand on the 4th day. He wore a dark suit. He sat in the witness box with the posture he had held at every briefing and every deposition and every hearing of his adult life. Straight, still, present. He did not look at Dunbar at the defense table. Ruiz took him through the sequence. His answers were precise and without embellishment. When they reached the gate, "Captain Reeves, when Officer Dunbar reached over your fence to flip the latch, what was your assessment?" My assessment was that an officer had committed a textbook violation of the curtilage doctrine, a clearly established constitutional principle taught in the first semester of every law enforcement training program in the country. He did it before he had turned the corner, before he had any visual information about the situation, before any assessment was possible. He had made his decision before he got out of the car. And what was the basis of that decision? In your assessment? Marcus looked at the jury. A phone call from a neighbor who watched me in my backyard for 4 minutes and 23 seconds, tending a smoker, refilling a water glass, sitting in a chair I had bought 3 weeks before, and then called the police because she did not recognize me as someone who belonged there. The basis was that I am a black man who had just moved into a house in this neighborhood. There is no other basis. There was never any other basis. He paused. I served 2 combat tours in Afghanistan. I came home with a Bronze Star with valor and a VA loan and 11 years of savings. I checked the deed 3 times at closing. I planted a garden. I seasoned a brisket. I was sitting in my own backyard. Another pause. He looked at the jury without looking away. It cost me an afternoon and a pair of wrists. It cost Leon Okafor 2 years of keeping a folder that nobody asked for and form letters that told him his experience didn't matter. It cost Rosa Delgado a shift and the specific humiliation of being told, in her own parking lot, that she looked like a criminal. And it cost this department and this community 14 separate chances to stop one man before he got to my gate. 14 complaints. 14 dismissals. Every single one of those 14 people had the courage to report what happened to them. The institution lacked the integrity to hear them. He let that sit. Then, he thought I was an easy target. He was wrong about what I was and what I would do. But none of that should be the point. Leon Okafor's folder deserved a room. Rosa Delgado deserved to walk to her car without being treated like a suspect. The 14 people before me deserved a complaint process that was actually a complaint process. That is the point. That has always been the point. He looked at Dunbar for the first time. He held his gaze for 3 seconds. He looked back at the jury. "That's all," he said. The civil jury deliberated for 3 hours and 27 minutes. The foreperson was a retired high school history teacher named Carol Pinter, 63 years old, who had spent 30 years teaching her students that the difference between what a country says it is and what it actually does is found in the specific, documented details of individual cases, in the folders people keep, in the recordings people make, in the 4-second looks that nobody can quite explain. She read the verdict in a steady voice that did not require amplification. Liability found on all counts. Dunbar personally liable. Qualified immunity denied. City of Harwick Estates liable. Failure to supervise a pattern of unconstitutional stops. In the federal criminal proceeding, the jury deliberated for 2 hours and 51 minutes. Guilty on all counts, deprivation of rights under color of law, assault. Judge Harold Fitch sentenced Dunbar 3 weeks after the criminal verdict. He was 67 years old and had been on the federal bench for 20 years. And he said, in a courtroom that was at capacity, "Mr. Dunbar, you were given authority over people, not ownership of them, authority, which means it was conditional, and lent, and revocable, and which carried an obligation that you treated as optional. You used the authority of your badge to sort people by a criterion that has no place in law enforcement and no place in a country that has spent a great deal of its history pretending to believe in equal protection. You had 14 opportunities to be stopped. You were protected from all 14. This court is the 15th opportunity, and this court is not in the business of protection." The gavel fell. The consequences arrived in sequence over the following weeks. Craig Dunbar was sentenced to 8 years in federal custody, personal civil liability, with qualified immunity denied, made him responsible for a portion of the damages that his own attorney described privately as career-ending in financial terms. Loss of pension, permanent law enforcement bar. Roy Haller pleaded guilty to obstruction and conspiracy 6 weeks after Dunbar's verdict. He accepted the plea on the advice of his attorney, who had reviewed the complaint dismissal records and the templated language, and told him that a trial would produce the same result with more public exposure. He received 4 years in federal custody and the loss of all retirement benefits accumulated across 23 years. As part of the plea, he provided a full accounting of the complaint suppression process, the review protocol, the template language, the specific communications with union representatives about managing liability exposure. This account was entered into the public record and became the foundation for a department-wide audit of the complaint review process going back 15 years. The union, having declined Dunbar's representation in the first week, issued a formal statement supporting the audit. They did not editorialize about the irony of this. Vera Colton's civil case was settled. Her attorney advised a settlement on the grounds that the camera footage, specifically the 4 minutes and 23 seconds of Vera watching from the window before making the call, made a jury trial inadvisable. The settlement amount was described by her attorney as significant. As a condition of the settlement, she provided a written apology, which was delivered to Marcus at his home on a Wednesday morning, by certified mail, in a plain white envelope. He opened it at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. He read it once. He placed it in a file folder. He went outside to check on the garden. 6 months after the incident, a for sale sign appeared in front of 410 Birchwood. The house sold in 3 weeks, and Vera Colton moved to her daughter's city. The house at 412 did not change. The smoker was still on the patio. The garden along the south fence was in its 2nd season. The peppers heavy now. The tomatoes staked and full. Leon Okafor received a settlement check that represented not just the financial acknowledgement of a specific wrong, but the first institutional confirmation in 2 years. That what he had documented in that folder had been real and had been wrong and had always been going to matter. He deposited it. He used part of it to take his daughter, who was 17 and had been watching the trial coverage on her phone during lunch at school and had told her father, after the verdict, that she wanted to study civil rights law, to visit 3 university campuses over a long weekend, on the drive home from the last campus. She said, "Dad, you kept the folder for 2 years and nothing happened. And then it happened." "Yes," Leon said. "So the folder mattered." "The folder always mattered," he said. "It just needed the right room." She looked out the window at the highway passing. "I want to be the person who builds the room," she said. Leon drove. The highway continued. It was an ordinary Wednesday, and it was not. Rosa Delgado received her settlement and a formal written apology from the department. She framed neither. She returned to work at the hospital on a Tuesday morning and parked in the same lot she had always parked in and walked to the entrance without changing her stride. And nobody said anything to her. And that was exactly what she had wanted. Danny Ortega received a formal commendation from the department under the new chief, Farrow having retired in the month following the verdict, for exemplary conduct in service of the truth under significant professional pressure. The commendation was written by the new chief personally, in language that was specific rather than general, citing the voice memo and the moment of its creation and the decision it represented. Ortega put it in a drawer. He went back to work. He was, by all accounts from his new partner and his new supervisor, the kind of officer his training had been designed to produce. He kept the voice memo on his personal hard drive. He did not expect to need it again. He kept it anyway, because keeping records was a practice he had come to understand as something other than a precaution. It was a form of respect for the truth, and for the people to whom the truth owed something. 2 weeks after the verdict, Marcus drove to the logistics depot on Route 12, where Leon Okafor started his shift at 6 a.m. He arrived at 5:47. He parked and waited by his truck. Leon came out at 5:53, jacket on, manifest in hand. He saw Marcus and stopped. "I wanted to thank you," Marcus said, "for the folder, for keeping it for 2 years when you had every reason not to." Leon looked at him. "You're the one who had the cameras. You had records when no one was asking for them. That's a different thing. That's harder." Leon was quiet for a moment. They stood in the early morning cold of the depot parking lot. Two men who had arrived at the same story from entirely different starting points, by entirely different means, with entirely different resources, and who had ended up, somehow, in the same room. "My daughter," Leon said. "She wants to study civil rights law. She's been talking about it since the trial. What is she? Junior? Senior? Junior? 17? Tell her to reach out to me when she's applying to programs." Marcus said, "I know people at several schools. She should know them too." Leon looked at him. "You mean that?" "Yes." Something settled in Leon's face. Not the end of something, but the beginning of something else. The specific, quiet expression of a man who has been handed back a future he had quietly stopped expecting. He extended his hand. Marcus shook it. Leon got in his truck. He drove his route. He would think about the conversation several times throughout the morning, between stops, in the pauses that a long route provides. He would think about his daughter's face in the car on the way home from the last campus visit. He would think about the folder still in the cabinet at home, which he had not thrown away even after the settlement. Because some things you keep not because they have use, but because they are true, and truth is worth keeping. The last Saturday of October. Marcus's backyard. The smoker had been going since 7 that morning, ribs this time, 6 hours in, the yard filling with the specific, unhurried scent of hickory and slow heat that Marcus had come to think of as the smell of a day with nothing wrong in it. Coltrane on the speaker. The garden along the south fence was at the end of its second season, the last peppers harvested, the tomato stakes still in the ground, the soil turned and mulched for winter. 15 people were on the patio and in the yard. Diane was there, with potato salad, a slightly larger batch than usual, based on the guest list, with the same undisclosed amount of mustard. Frank Kowalski was at the grill with a pair of tongs, having appointed himself deputy pitmaster on the grounds that he had shown up to enough of these that he had earned a title. He was wearing an apron that Diane had brought as a joke and that he had put on without irony and was wearing with complete conviction. Danny Ortega was there. Marcus had called him 2 weeks after the verdict. A brief call. No preamble. "I'm doing a cookout on Saturday. You should come." Ortega had said yes with the relief of someone who was not certain they deserved to be invited and was grateful to have been asked anyway. He stood near the garden with a plate, talking to Leon Okafor's daughter, who had driven up with Leon and who had been asking him questions for the past 20 minutes about what it was actually like to be in the situation he had been in, and what it had felt like to press record, and whether he had been afraid. He was answering honestly, which was the only way he knew how to answer. Leon was by the smoker with Marcus, both of them looking at the temperature gauge with the focused attention of men who understood that good things took time and were worth the waiting. Frank Kowalski crossed the patio at one point and put his hand briefly on Marcus's shoulder, just briefly, a single moment of contact, and said nothing. It was the gesture of a man who had something to say and had concluded that the gesture said it better. Marcus nodded. That was enough. Craig Dunbar entered federal custody at FCE Elkton, Ohio, 29 days after sentencing. He is housed in protective custody, standard classification for former law enforcement. His first parole review is at year 4. He has filed one appeal. It was denied on procedural grounds. He does not intend to file another. The backyard at 412 Birchwood Avenue runs most Saturdays between October and April, when the weather permits. The garden along the south fence has been through 2 full growing seasons now. The oak tree in the back corner drops its leaves in November and comes back in April with the specific, unhurried indifference of something that measures time in a register that human events do not reach. The camera on the gate still records to the cloud. Marcus checked the settings last week and found everything working exactly as it should. Marcus Reeves never asked to be anyone's story. He asked to be left alone in his backyard on a Sunday afternoon, which is a small and ordinary thing to ask and which, in the specific geography of his country and his skin and his neighborhood, required a great deal more than it should have. But there is a particular kind of person, built by years of moving through places where things go wrong and coming out the other side with both the tools and the patience to address what needs addressing, who cannot let a wrong pass because the cost of letting it pass falls on people who have less than he does. Not because of his service record, not because of his cameras, because Leon Okafor's folder deserved a room, because Rosa Delgado deserved to walk to her parking lot without being stopped, because the 14 people before him deserved a complaint process that actually functioned. The brisket was finally ready. The backyard was full, the gate was locked, from the inside, exactly as it should be.